Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to 5 great Viking deaths and in brackets what they tell us about the Viking mindset. So this is from Epic History TV. So I do know a little bit about Viking history, but as I said, as I usually say with reacting to any historical content, if I don't react or say much, it's because of it's trying to take on some information that might be interesting. So, well, it should be interesting. So the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go subscribe to Epic History TV, and if they have any sponsors, go check out their sponsors as well. So without further ado, let's not waste more time. Let's get into this. And God, that's not... The Vikings and their descendants speak for themselves. There are many voices express a spirit which is like no other on earth. It's true. Professor Tom Shippey, laughing shall I die.
AD 793. Raiders appear without warning off England's east coast. They land at Lindisfarne, known as Holy Island, where they slaughter monks, steal treasure and holy relics, then vanish back.
But one thing that a lot of people don't realise, that Vikings weren't just pirates. They were traders. They were people. But I think it's something to do with the conflict in Norway during those times as well, which caused them, or all around Scandinavia, which caused them to go into greener pastures like the north of Europe, and well, they're all over the place, but one of their first major targets was England.
Across the Dark Sea.
I think they did settle in Scotland, but the only Viking part I know about Scotland is the Orkney Isles, and I know they definitely settled in somewhere in Ireland, but I'm not entirely sure.
It was Western Europe's first traumatic encounter with the Vikings. For 3 centuries, these pagan pirates from Scandinavia terrorized Europe, raiding, extorting, enslaving, and ultimately conquering. They roamed deep into Russia and the Mediterranean, even daring to attack what they called Miklagard, the great city Constantinople.
That's what doesn't usually get talked about, is how far east they actually went, like through, I think that's the Volga River that goes into the Black Sea. I'm not entirely sure.
Viking longships and a mastery of seamanship and navigation gave them the ability to strike at will, with the element of surprise.
Oh, yeah.
But their enemies, including Anglo-Saxons and Franks, themselves belonged to proud warrior cultures. Was there something more?
Mostly Christians.
That gave the Vikings their lethal edge. Professor Tom Shippey is an expert in Viking history and medieval literature. He believes their success can be attributed in part to a unique mindset. A mindset revealed in the Vikings' own sagas.
We have a great many sagas written in the Vikings' own language, which is Old Norse. There's the famous sagas of Icelanders, but there's also Konungasögur, that's sagas of kings. There's Fornaldasögur, sagas of old times. These are looked on with suspicion these days because they were written hundreds of years later, mostly in far-off Iceland. And people say, oh, well, you can't rely on those for history. They're fiction. Well, actually, a lot of it is fiction, and some of it's fairy tale, and you can pick that out quite easily. But a lot of it isn't fiction. I think it's based on family memories, and people who can't read and write often have good memories, and they take memories seriously and they pass them on. Leaving the fact and fiction question aside, they do all express, I think, a very characteristic and consistent attitude, which I call the Viking mindset. And that's really quite distinctive. Two of the distinctive things about it are the fascination with scenes of death with famous death songs, with famous last stands, all that kind of thing. And the other is the very characteristic sense of humor, which I call, I'm afraid, it's not good sense of humor, it's bad sense of humor. It's the kind of humor which is really rather cruel or grim. And we see quite a lot of it.
We'll look at 5 famous death scenes from the old Norse sagas to see what they can tell us about the Viking mindset. This video is sponsored by Curiosity Stream, home to thousands of online documentaries about science, technology, the natural world, and history.
It's kind of weird how, like, you know,
has hundreds of
he talks about like having a very, what we consider as a bad sense of humor, but like,
world wars and beyond.
but it's like,
Our particular
usually,
is the Nile, 5,000
well,
years of
how
history,
Vikings prefer to
presented by
die
British
in battle
broadcaster
so they can
and
reach the
author
halls of
Benjamin
Valhalla,
Hughes.
which their
It's an immersive,
spirits would be
engaging,
taken there by the
beautifully filmed
Valkyries,
journey along the Nile,
and
exploring
the
its
other ones who
crucial
die
role
in
in
dishonor,
Egypt's glorious
illness,
past.
age,
Curiosity Stream features many
usually go to
award-winning
Helheim,
exclusives
or
and
Hell
originals,
for short.
and all its content can be streamed to any device, so you can watch at any time, anywhere.
But
for a limited time, you can
But I
sign
wonder
up on
if
your
they'll
smart
talk
TV
about either
using the
Ragnar
code
Lothbrok
EPICHISTORY
or
to get 40%
or
off
Harald
an annual
Hardrada,
subscription.
because
That's just $12
I think Harald
for
Hardrada,
years
if I remember
access
right, was the
to an
last of the
incredible range
Vikings in
documentaries.
England,
You can
or the
also sign
Viking
up
Age
using
in
the link
England
in our
was
video
over.
description. Thanks to Curiosity
So it'll be
Stream
interesting to
for
see
sponsoring
like
this
what
video.
Vikings he talks about. So anyway,
Many tales are told of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. His own saga says he was the son of a Swedish king and slew a dragon, but that when he sailed to England seeking further fame and riches, he was shipwrecked off the coast of Northumbria. He was taken prisoner by its Christian king, Ella, who decided to inflict a terrible death on the famous Viking. He had him thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. As he faced death, Ragnar called out to the king.
The famous line from the death of Ragnar is Gnithia mundu grisir ef galtar hag vissi. The piggies would grunt if they knew how the old boar died.
wow.
The word Gnithia, it means grunt, but it also kind of sounds like grunt. And I think you could actually translate it, go oink oink. The piggies would go oink oink if they knew how the old boar died. It's a joke. And
Wow.
the joke is actually on King Ella, because there's this barnyard vocabulary, piggies and oink, but what it means is, my sons are going to come, and what they do to you won't bear thinking about.
Wow.
It's a threat. The funny thing is, although it's a late saga,
Imagine getting that sort of threat. That if you're the man who dies and you're threatening your sons will reap such a revenge on you that it would not be worth thinking about. You gotta admit that's gotta be some sort of shudder in your spine.
this story about the piggies was known earlier, because it was actually quoted by a Latin chronicler. He'd heard about the piggies, he got the phrase right, he just didn't understand what it meant. He thought Ragnar was saying, if my sons knew about this, they'd come and rescue me. But he didn't. He wasn't hoping to rescue, he knew he hadn't got any hope. He was saying, my sons, when they hear about this, then they'll avenge me. And of course
Wow.
they did.
Oh yeah.
Ragnar's
and
death
Ivar
in
the
a snake
Boneless.
pit is almost certainly invented, but his sons, the piggies, were very real. In 865,
Yeah.
the Ragnarsons landed in England with a great army, rampaging across East Anglia and Northumbria and
Wow.
killing King Ella. Is there any link between these historical events and the saga tale of Ragnar's death?
England was invaded by men who were very early on identified as the Ragnarsons. And my suggestion would be that the whole story of Ragnar's death in the snake pit was made up later on in order to motivate the invasion of England. Why did the
Wow.
Ragnarsons invade England? They did it to take vengeance for their father. And so you make up a story about the death of the father and the way that the vengeance was motivated.
King Hroth avenged Lear, Denmark. I probably butchered that pronunciation.
According to legend, Rolf Kraki was a great Danish king of the 6th century, a Danish King Arthur. His great hall stood near Leire, where he entertained a famous band of champions. But many sought his throne. His own cousin, Hjörvarthr, made a surprise dawn attack on the king's hall. After a desperate last stand, Hrolf lay dead, surrounded by his champions. Only one man survived. Vögr, the weakest man in Hrolf's court. He'd been the butt of all jokes, even when he'd sworn to avenge Hrolf's death. Now he was hauled before the new king, Hjörvarthr.
Rolf is dead, and all his champions are dead as well. That's the right thing to do, except Vögr, who is dragged out of a pile of bodies. And for some reason, Hjörvarthr thinks it would be a good idea to get a pledge of allegiance from Hrolf's last surviving champion. So they get Vögr, and he is hauled up, asked to swear allegiance to Hjörvarthr, and Hjörvarthr gives him his sword to swear allegiance on. Bad idea. Vögr picks it up, runs Hjörvarthr through. That's the end of Hjörvarthr and the Skildung dynasty, and of course Vögr is immediately killed. But he has fulfilled his vow. So it's another example, really, of the Viking love of, shall we say, wit, of being able to turn the tables in a funny kind of way. Once again, Ragnar's joke was on King Ella, and Vögr's joke is on King Hjörvarthr. Very funny, in a sort of way.
Legends about King Hrolf come from a tumultuous period of Europe's history, traditionally known as the Dark Ages. But recent discoveries suggest the tales of King Hrolf have a basis in fact.
King Hrolf is the Danish King Arthur. They lived at about the same time in the early 6th century. For a long time, the story of King Hrolf was regarded rather like the story of King Arthur, it couldn't be true. But then the archaeologists, alerted by a chance discovery, started looking at the traditional site of King Hrolf's court, which is now the small village of Leire in Denmark. And much to their surprise, they discovered the site of one enormous hall after another. I think they have now found 6 of them, all through the Viking and pre-Viking era.
Wow.
So that part of the story at least was true. Leire, once upon a time Hlethraborg, really was a major power centre in the early Viking period.
How Jomsvikings died.
The Jomsvikings were a legendary group of Viking mercenaries, picked men bound by a code of honour. According to Old Norse sagas, they had a fortified base on the Baltic coast at Jomsborg. In 986, they were recruited by the King of Denmark to subjugate Jarl Håkon of Lauder. But at Hjörungavágr, they suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Jarl Håkon and his son Jarl Eirik. Vikings rarely offered or expected mercy. After the battle, the Jomsviking prisoners were lined up for execution.
The beheading started, and the Jomsvikings, who had a code of their own which forbade them to express fear at any point. One of them, for instance, said he would not kneel down to be beheaded. He insisted on standing up and being beheaded from the front so that people could see that he did not flinch from the blow.
Wow.
One guy does kneel down to be beheaded, and he says, I'm a bit worried about my hair. I don't want to get blood on it. Could somebody very kindly take my hair and pull it over my head, and then the beheading can go on. But as the axe falls, he jerks his head back, and the falling axe cuts off the hands of the man who's been holding his hair. Well, that's bad sense of humour for you. What a joke. Everybody laughs like nobody's business. In particular, actually, Jarl Eirik, who thinks he's never seen anything so funny in all his life. It was such a good joke, he says, well, we'll let you off. And the Jomsviking very properly says, can't accept that unless you let all the others off too. So the other Jomsvikings are then all spared. Well, obviously complete fiction. No, can't believe a word of it. Yeah, about 15 miles away in that direction from where we're standing. Just recently, they were digging for a new road and they came upon a pile of skeletons, about 50 odd, and a separate pile of skulls. All the skeletons had been beheaded, and analysis showed they were all male, they were mostly young, and they were all Scandinavians. Okay, so there was a mass beheading, just as described in the saga, and furthermore, several of the men had been beheaded from the front, just as in the saga. So, once again, what appeared to be complete fiction turns out to have some corroboration in hard fact.
The death of King Olaf's skull.
Olaf Haraldsson, King of Norway, the man who'd one day become its patron saint, had been a feared Viking before he became a Christian king. In 1029, the Danes, supported by local jarls, drove Olaf into exile. When he and his followers returned the next year to reclaim the throne, they were met by a huge army of hostile pagan farmers. Retreat was not an option for Olaf. On the morning of battle, the restless king rose early and asked his poet, Thormod, to sing to him, to pass the hours before the army gathered.
And Thormod immediately starts to sing the Bjarkamal, which is actually a poem supposed to be sung by Böðvar Bjarki on the morning of the last stand of King Hroth, which we've discussed already.
Wow.
Dagar is opkomen dunja hana fjadrar, maules vil mögum at vinna elfidi. Vaki eok vaki, vinna hövuð, allir inni utstu aðils of sinar. Haar in hathgreipi, rofel skutandi, uitum góðir menn, there is ekki flygja. Vekka útrat vini, neat vifs runum, vek útr höðum, hildar at leiki. The day has come up, the roosters clap their wings, time for the wretched serfs to do the heavy labor.
Wow.
Wake now, wake, company of friends, all you best ones of Athil's people. Har the hard grip, Hroth the shooter, men of good birth, they who do not flee. I do not wake you to wine, nor the whispers of women. I wake you to the hard sport of Hilda.
It seems a strange choice for a poem because it is in a way a suicide poem. It's saying we're all going to get killed.
Wow.
Is this a good morale raiser? Yeah, they're Vikings. They think it's great. Everybody says, super song, just the thing. Let's get started on the battle.
Wow.
But the odds were stacked against King Olaf and his men. Thormod's song of brave men rising to face certain death proved a premonition.
The battle is lost. King Olaf is killed fighting in the front rank and is brought down by a series of spear and axe blows. And as you would expect, all his chosen companions, all his bodyguard are killed around him. But Thormod the poet, survives. Not his fault, he just happens to survive. And at the end of the battle, when it's all over, he laments that he has not been allowed to join his king. And at that moment, an arrow comes flying from nowhere and hits him. And the obvious implication is the dead king sent it. He sent it so as to give Thormod his wish that he could join Olaf. And Thormod then composes a poem about his own wound and dies without quite finishing it. He dies on his feet, still reciting the poem, but he doesn't complete the last line.
It's like, I know I'm going a bit off topic here, bit like, what's it called? Charles Dickens with Bloody Drood. I don't think that was a story that was ever finished.
Which fortunately is completed for him by a bystander.
Okay.
And the bystander is the teenage Harald Hardrada.
Whoa. Harald Hardrada's last stand. Oh, I know about that.
Harald Hardrada grew to become King of Norway and one of the greatest Vikings of all. His adventures led him east to the city of Kiev, where he served at the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Then to Constantinople, where he commanded the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor. As King of Norway, Harold the Hard Ruler was brave, cruel, and acquisitive, and in 1066 set his sights on the English throne. But King Harold Godwinson marched north to...
Which, if I remember, was because of a promise of one of the former Danish kings of England. Said that when he died, Harold Hardrada can claim the throne, even though one of the other former Viking kings, who was a Norman, promised that to he was first called William the Bastard because he was born out of wedlock, and he was the Duke of Normandy. And but Harold Godwinson, you kind of got to admit, he kind of stole the throne, even though Godwinson promised to William over holy relics and Christianity. That is a big oath. That's a severe oath if you're a Christian, unfortunately. But in a way, by what I've learned, you got to admit, Harold Godwinson kind of stole and usurped the throne for himself.
To meet him.
But that's just greed for you, because bearing in mind, with Christians, kings are supposed to be like they're chosen by a divine right or something like that. Unfortunately, because of the Pope. But yeah, Stamford Bridge, I think, is roughly round here, because Harold Hardrada defeated the one of the Saxon lords there, or ealdormen, whatever you want to call them. But I think what caught the Vikings off guard was the speed that the Saxons got to the Vikings, which that took in 2 days. Usually a walk like that would take about a week or two, so that's impressive.
Moving so rapidly, he caught the Vikings off guard at Stamford Bridge.
The thing about the Battle of Stamford Bridge is that Harold Hardrada and his invasion force, they were caught napping.
Wow.
Harold Godwinson marched very quickly up to York and kept on marching through York, and the first thing the Norwegians knew about it was seeing the glint of weapons approaching. But it was a hot day, and the Norwegians had left their heavy equipment, especially their armor and their shields, down on their ships. So they were actually facing an armored force without their armor.
Heedless of the risk, Hardrada advanced into battle at the head of his men. According to the Heimskringla sagas, written by the Icelander Snorri Sturluson, he composed poetry even now.
Framgöngum veri fylkegu, brunju lösir und blåregjar, Hjalmar skina, hefkat mina, nu ligger skruð vart at skipum nithri. Forward we go in formation, without armor against blue steel edges. Helmets shine, I don't have mine. Now our gear lies down with the ships.
I think it's quite good, actually, the poem. But Harold, who is a terrible poetic snob, thinks about it for a bit and says, no, that was too simple. And then he produces another poem in a much more complex and high-class meter, and says that's much better.
Hardrada threw himself into the thick of the fighting, unarmored, wielding his sword with both hands. Fearless and defiant to the end, he died with an English arrow in his throat, alongside most of his army. He is often called the last Viking.
According to the saga, the Norwegians arrived in 400 ships and the survivors went home in 24. The Anglo-Saxons let them go. That, you might say, put an end to ideas that England could be conquered by Norwegians or Danes or Vikings. The Viking era then was over. Harold Hardrada, you can only say, well, he died like a Viking, making jokes, making poems, lashing out with both hands until he was killed.
Wow.
But can these poems really be attributed to Harald Hardrada?
I don't see there's any way that the poems could be genuine. After all, who was there to note it down or remember it? Practically none of the Norwegians survived. I expect Snorri Sturluson made them up himself to help his story out. But they're good poems. They express a kind of, not regretful attitude, but it's sort of rueful. Yeah, well, we're not going to win this one. They caught us this time. Oh well, that's the way it goes. We will just have to fight it out. And that strikes me as, again, a characteristic Viking attitude.
The Battle of Stamford Bridge had unintended consequences, paving the way for another invader to become King of England.
The Battle of Stamford Bridge was, of course, a catastrophe. It was a catastrophe for the Norwegians, but it was a catastrophe for the English as well, because they took very heavy casualties as well. And 3 weeks after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, they fought the Battle of Hastings against William the Conqueror. And you can't help thinking, if they'd been at full strength, they'd have won.
On the 14th of October, 1066.
That is a debated point, though, but it's a good point, even though it's debated. But bear in mind, William the Conqueror was first known as William the Bastard because he was born out of wedlock, because his father slept with a tanner's daughter. One weird story that when William was in his adulthood and in the town of Alençon in Normandy or northern France, most of the citizens there were not happy about a bastard king being in charge, or a bastard being in charge of a French duchy. That most of the local peasants were beating on animal skins as an insult to his commoner mother, and he was quite, from what I heard, he was quite ruthless in gaining revenge on most of the people who insulted his commoner mother. Like, well, one of the stories, I'm not going to say all of them because I can't remember half of them, but one of them is cutting for one person. Sometimes he'll find one prisoner, he'll order both their arms to be cut off and then sent back, then released. So he put that down pretty ruthlessly. So that's why William was quite the tough guy.
The English army suffered a crushing defeat at Hastings, and Harold Godwinson was killed. England's new king, William the Conqueror, was himself descended from a Viking adventurer. The Viking Age.
That's another thing people forget. William the Conqueror is a descendant of. He's a Viking descendant. So because England went through a throne where it was ruled by Vikings, then it was ruled by Saxons, then it was ruled by Vikings, then it was ruled by Saxons, and it kept going back and forth for a long time. But also, Vikings and Saxons also have to fight Britons, which are like the English and Welsh Celtic tribes as well. That survived. That sort of survived even being under the rule of the Romans. So it was never going to be entirely peaceful.
Was at an end. For nearly 3 centuries, Europe had been terrorized by Scandinavian warriors whose attitude to death gave them a dangerous edge.
What finally strikes me about the Viking mindset is not so much the defiance in the face of death, that's what you expect heroes to do.
Yeah.
It's actually the matter-of-fact attitude, and also the liking for some kind of a joke. You can actually use vulgar words, like Ragnar in the snake pit. You can play dirty tricks, like Vugger with his Pledge of Allegiance. Or you can play practical jokes, like the Jomsviking getting the guy's hands cut off. Or you can nitpick about poetry, like Thormod and Harald Hardrada. All these say, death is coming, it's certain, but actually I'm going to see what I can do to make this memorable. What it makes me think is that when it comes to Vikings, you can kill them, and speaking as an Englishman, we did over there. But frighten them, that's not going to work.
Yeah, you're never going to
They're
frighten
always going to come back at you. You're not safe until the very last one of them is dead.
Holyrood Church, the parish of Bucklandmead.
Thank you to Curiosity.
And that'll do it. This has been another interesting video about Epic History TV. And yeah, as the good professor said, that if you're going to try and scare a Norse warrior or a Viking warrior, you're not going to. Not with their attitude towards death in battle. So, but as I said, they weren't always monsters, even though they did do horrible things like, you know, pillaging, rape, and pillaging as much as they can. But they weren't entirely merciless, because a lot of it has been over exaggerated. Most of it was propaganda by Saxons, especially King Alfred the Great of King Alfred the Great of Wessex. So anyway, this has been another good video. If you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.